Hi, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to our webinar today, MetaThemes and MetaTrends in Assessment, Enduring Principles, Emerging Opportunities. My name is Brianne and I help with the webinars here at Weave, so thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here and we're really looking forward to hearing our presenters. If you're new to our webinars, I just wanted to quickly review the control panel for you so that you're able to interact with us. Over on the far left, you can control if you have audio through your computer or through your phone. And if you're having any technical difficulties, you can use that chat feature to send us a message directly and we'll try and help you out with it. And if you'd like to post a question for our presenters, we ask that you use the Q&A feature and you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation and we'll share those at the end. And if you need to leave for any reason, you can either close out of your window or click leave the webinar, which is found over there on the far left. Or the far right. We are recording the session today, so if you need a copy or know anyone else who would be interested in watching it, we'll be sending it out afterwards. And finally, we do have a short survey that will pop up at the end, and your feedback really shapes what we do, so we really appreciate if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete it. And by completing the survey, it will enter you into a book drawing, and you can win a copy of Trends in Assessment, Ideas, Opportunities, and Issues for Higher Education, which is co-edited by today's presenters. And with that, I'll let Dr. Ray Van Dyke, the Senior Vice President here at Weave, introduce our speakers. So thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Brianne. And I also thank each of you for joining us today for our first webinar in the new year. We had some great webinars last year, and we're looking forward to continue to provide even more this year that are going to be helpful to you as you're doing the important work on your campuses. We're kicking off the year with a couple of great presenters who I'm sure are going to share with us some really important insights and also challenge us to think in some unique and different ways about the work that we do for our institutions. I'm really excited about this presentation, and one of the many features, I think, distinguishing features about it is it truly is an aggregation of and a reflection on data from several very important sources to us, including Assessment Update, which many of us read regularly, the Assessment Institute in Indianapolis, where our two presenters are actively engaged in the presentation of that institute, and of course the new book that's co-edited by our presenters today, Trends in Assessment, Ideas, Opportunities, and Issues for Higher Education. I'm sure all of you are familiar with at least one of these sources, if not all, because they inform our work, I think, in great ways. I would like to quickly give out a quick shout out to our colleagues at Stylus Publishing, who have graciously offered to provide 3 copies of the book, which, as Brianne said, will be given as part of a drawing for when respondents to our survey at the end that gives us feedback on what kinds of things we need to be thinking about and preparing for you. They also are providing a 20% discount for today's attendees if you wish to purchase the book. And all of that information we'll go over more at the end, and also will be in the message that each of you will get after the webinar concludes. Now to move quickly on to our presenters so that they can have lots of time to share with you. I'm going to provide a quick introduction since we included their biographies, which highlighted their many accomplishments in the invitation that we sent you. Both of our presenters are active practitioners in the assessment field. Both are at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI, where Dr. Stephen Hundley serves as the Senior Advisor to the Chancellor for Planning and Institutional Improvement. He has a host of duties and responsibilities there, but the one that we probably know him best by is he chairs the annual Assessment Institute. That is an amazing event in which most of us attending this webinar have probably had the opportunity to attend and learn and increase our knowledge and add to our assessment toolboxes with the many wonderful sessions that are presented there. And along with him is his colleague, Dr. Susan Kahn, who serves as Director of Planning and Institutional Improvement Initiatives at IUPUI. A number of accomplishments for her, but one that really kind of stands out to me is her implementation of an institution-wide approach for using electronic portfolios. to enhance assessment and student learning, and her just tremendous knowledge and insight into the ways institutions can demonstrate accountability for student learning and educational effectiveness. So with all of that said, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Stephen and Susan to begin their presentation, and we'll have a little blip here as we switch over and they'll take over the screen. Thank you both so very much for being with us.
Well, Ray and Brianne and colleagues, Ray and Brianne in particular, thank you, and colleagues joining us watching live and watching remotely later on, thank you as well for your interest in our topic. I'm Stephen Hunley from IEPUI, and we won't belabor any of the introductions that Ray mentioned, and we appreciate that background, but I'll simply say that I've been at IEPUI for 22 years, and with my colleague Susan, we've been involved in the Assessment Institute in Indianapolis for a number of those years. Many of you know it was founded by Trudy Bonta. We'll tell you more about that as we get into the program, but let me also have my colleague Susan introduce herself and begin with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Kahn. I have also been at IEPUI for 22 years. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. We're very happy to have the opportunity to do this today, and we would like to thank our colleagues at Weave for inviting us to provide this webinar. We're very excited about it. And with that, I think we will move on apace. As we worked through the contributions to the book, contributions from some 45 different individuals, we noticed some recurring themes. And those themes will describe what our outcomes are for today's webinar. Some of those enduring themes were long-held principles of assessment that were reaffirmed by the various chapters and contributions to the volume. Others are genuinely new trends that question some of the received ideas about assessment. So you'll hear a little bit about each, some perennial truths or foundational ideas, as well as some new developments that we think are beginning to emerge.
And fear not, we will put you to work with some action planning and some time for Q&A toward the end of our webinar as well. So let me mention, of course, Ray talked about the different sources that have informed our work both for the book and for today's webinar. One, of course, that many of you we hope are familiar with is the Assessment Institute in Indianapolis. It's the nation's oldest and largest event of its type, and we have had that convened in Indianapolis since 1992. Our colleague, Trudy Bonta, who joined our campus from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, brought with her this gathering, and we're very pleased to continue that tradition since Trudy has retired in 2016. As you probably know, if you're not familiar with it already, we do have a large number of participants every October, over 1,000 colleagues from every state and several foreign countries, usually over 450 colleges, universities, and other organizations are represented, to gather to talk about assessment and improvement. But as Susan and I have noted, it's really beyond just assessment and improvement. It's really a higher education conference writ large with lots of different contributors from all types of institutions and all parts of the campus setting. As you can see on the slide here, we're a very inclusive environment. We bring together colleagues from all parts of higher education, from all academic disciplines and other parts of campus. Every type of program and setting is welcome and reflected. We have scholars and practitioners who are very advanced in this work, but we're very privileged and pleased to offer a venue for those newer to the journey who are interested in showcasing and sharing their work. IEPUI, our institution to which Susan and I belong, has been the founding organizer and host of the Institute since 1992. We're very fortunate to involve several colleagues and partner organizations, principally the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. Many of you know that as NILOA. At the bottom of the screen, you can see an alphabet soup of different associations. We won't go through and quiz you on each one of them, but I suspect many of you know at least one of these types of organizations in our alphabet soup there. And I don't know if this were Wheel of Fortune, we might need to buy a vowel with some of them. But you can see the array of associations and research organizations that partner with us and make intellectual contributions to our program. As Ray mentioned, in addition to the Assessment Institute in Indianapolis, we also edit Assessment Update, which is a periodical that comes out 6 times a year, published by Wiley, Jossey-Bass, and it's been going strong for over 30 years. Each of the editions include about 5 to 7 articles or columns that have different perspectives on assessment and improvement. Many of our colleagues who attend the Institute, the Assessment Institute, subsequently develop for Assessment Update an article from their presentation. We have a national readership. We're very fortunate to have those colleagues, both individual and institutional subscribers. The leadership editorial team you see noted on the screen, Trudy Bonta was the founding editor. Susan and I have editorial responsibility for Assessment Update, and we are very fortunate to have several other subject matter experts and contributors who work with us to produce Assessment Update throughout the years. So against the backdrop of both Assessment Institute and Assessment Update, the large gathering and the publication that comes out several times a year, we asked, when we took responsibility more fully for these items in 2016, we asked our colleagues who serve as track leaders of the Assessment Institute, those who convene various subject-oriented tracks and thematic tracks, we asked them to take a look at all of the material for the past several years that they had been organizing and producing at the Assessment Institute. We asked them to produce some executive summaries of that material. Concurrently, we asked our colleagues who serve as our student research assistant team to really go back with Assessment Update and look at the previous articles and editions over the last several years, to look at other abstracts and presentations that had come forward with Assessment Institute, and to kind of develop for us some themes and trends that we saw that were percolating up from these different sources. So what you see on the slide in front of you now are just a quick summary of the categories of themes that are reflected in both Assessment Institute and Assessment Update. There are levels of assessment. This occurs at the assignment and the individual student level, all the way up to systematic review of and improvement across entire systems of higher education. Assessment in various contexts to include different disciplines, but also in the co-curricular, community, international, and experiential contexts. Certainly a variety of assessment methods and lots of stakeholders involved in the process, which we'll acknowledge as we get further into the webinar. Importantly, linking and integrating assessment to other valued institutional processes we've seen grow and develop over time. The perpetual challenge and clarion call of using assessment findings to facilitate ongoing improvement, student learning and success, and institutional effectiveness. And then, of course, we're always on the lookout for it and are fortunate to have lots of contributors talking about emerging ideas, new ideas in assessment. So we asked each of our track leaders to produce these summaries. We asked our student research assistant team to help us do all of this, primarily to help us continue to refresh the Assessment Institute and Assessment Update for the future. But in reviewing all of that material, we said, gee, there's something special here. There's something nice to have here. Maybe this would be a good book to produce. And so with that backdrop, we were able to partner with, and grateful to Stylus as well, to partner with them to debut Trends in Assessment, Ideas, Opportunities, and Issues for Higher Education at the 2019 Assessment Institute in Indianapolis. And if you attended our institute in October, you were the recipient of a special Institute edition of the book. It's the same content that's there that you see on the slide there at the Stylus website, but we were able to offer that as a complimentary product for those attending the 2019 Assessment Institute in Indianapolis. It was debuted there in advance of its wider commercial release. So we are grateful to all of our colleagues who contributed to Trends in Assessment. As Susan mentioned, 45 plus individuals contributed to this volume. And with that, I'd like to ask Susan to begin diving a little more deeply into what we see in the pages of Trends in Assessment.
Thank you, Stephen. In the introduction to the book, we take as our starting point Palamba and Bonta's definition of assessment, which is a pretty traditional one. And although this says 2015, the definition was put forth earlier in the first edition of the book in 1999, I believe. So the definition defines assessment as the measurement of specific domains of knowledge and achievement in individual students in order to determine patterns of strengths and weaknesses across groups of students, as opposed to grading, whose purpose is to focus is to provide feedback and create a record of achievement for individual students. So the idea here is that assessment focuses on patterns across groups, grading focuses on the individual student. Accountability has often been the primary or immediate driver for assessment, but the ultimate higher, greater purpose of assessment is to improve teaching, learning, curricula, and educational quality. Currently, as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, most institutions in the US are doing assessment. Some are doing it very well. Others are not necessarily doing it so well, if only because their accrediting organizations require it. In recent years, assessment has rapidly spread from the formal curriculum to the co-curriculum through programs administered by student affairs offices and out-of-class experiences like internships, service learning, and undergraduate research. We've seen a proliferation of assessment methods and practices, a booming, expanding assessment technology industry, which I guess we're contributing to right now in this webinar, as well as in the last 10 years or so, debates about whether assessment has led to improved teaching, learning, and achievement. So as we thought about the book and what we wanted to talk about in the book, we came up with several foundational questions that we wanted to ask. And one of these was, after 35 years of assessment in the United States, how are we approaching assessment now? What has stayed the same? What has changed? What's new? How can we design assessments so that they yield the most useful information to guide improvements? And perhaps even more fundamentally, what do our assessment designs suggest about how we should design student learning experiences? And what do our assessment designs tell us about what we consider the most important kinds of learning to be?
So against the backdrop of our approach and philosophy for the book, let me mention that the next two slides really offer an overview to the main themes from Trends in Assessment. And in fact, these also represent the titles of each of the chapters in the book. And each of our chapters were authored by those colleagues who organized tracks at the Assessment Institute. They were drawn from those executive summaries, as I mentioned earlier, from the presentations at the Assessment Institute, but they were also, our colleagues who contributed to the book also did conduct their own due diligence by looking in the literature and looking at practices that were reflected elsewhere. So while the book was conceived and organized largely emerging from the Assessment Institute in Indianapolis, the material that reflects each of the chapters involves not only material from the Assessment Institute, but also reflects what is in the literature at the time of publishing this book. Let me briefly mention that the very first chapter, Movement Afoot, Fostering Discourse on Assessment Scholarship, was authored by colleagues from NILOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, and really does provide a great framing for the rest of the book as well. The rest of the chapter titles you see, we have one focusing on high impact practices, one focusing on global learning and the emerging practices that are involved in that space. Certainly one on community engagement, and this is not just service learning, it includes that, but it certainly speaks to other types of aspects of institutional engagement with their communities. Chapter number 5 focuses on a growing need for holistic learning support as it relates to student affairs assessment working in the co-curricular. STEM education and assessment, it's a relatively new track at the Institute, but as many of us know, that's an area where we see a lot of need for ongoing involvement, especially as it relates to diversifying the STEM talent pipeline and assuring that students both in STEM disciplines and other disciplines are well poised to be critical consumers of scientific and other facts. Continuing on the themes of our Trends in Assessment book, we have certainly a chapter devoted to graduate and professional education and the growing need for and focus on trends in that space. One on faculty development, and especially as it relates to how we measure faculty learning as it relates to faculty time and attention, not only as it relates to assessment, but also broadly speaking, the rest of their work portfolio as well. Susan Kahn wrote a chapter on e-portfolio assessment, and I will say it's probably one of our shining examples in the book. So if you're going to pick out the book and read a chapter, certainly you can read any of them in chronology, in sort of chronological order, but they're also designed to be read individually and jumping in at any point you'd like to jump into. So that's a great one if you're not as familiar with ePortfolio. I highly recommend that. I say that not just because she's threatening bodily harm sitting next to me if I don't give that one a plug. We conclude the book with the last 3 chapters. Lots of improvement, lots of assessment, little improvement, how to fix the broken system. Our colleague Keston Fulcher from James Madison University Center for Assessment and Research Studies authored that. Using assessment trends in planning, decision making, and improvement. Our colleague here at IUPUI, Michelle Hansen, who leads our institutional research and decision support function, authored that. And finally, Susan and I had a chance with chapter 12 to really have some fun. We first asked each one of our partners of the Assessment Institute to make a brief statement on what they thought, what they saw as future trends in assessment from their vantage point, and reflect back to that slide earlier that listed all of those different partners. So several of them made great statements, around several hundred-word statements around what they thought were themes and trends in assessment from their unique vantage point. What Susan and I then endeavored to do, and we're going to use this as the framing for the rest of our webinar, is we had a chance to look back at the preceding chapters in the book, along with what our partners were articulating as future trends in assessment. And we tried to pull it all together in what we've come up with in 10 meta trends in assessment. That will be the focus of the rest of the webinar. So if you're thinking about this, it's almost like coming into the last 10 minutes of a movie. You're going to get the summary. You're going to get the capstone experience of the book in the next several slides that really talk about the meta trends in assessment. We think these are great synthesis and summary, but we also would encourage you, as possible, to go back and look at each of the individual chapters because they're worth a read individually to see how the meta trends take shape over the course of the book. So without further ado, we'll jump right into our first meta trend, meta theme in assessment.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for the shout out to my chapter. Much appreciated. I'm sure our working relationship will be much improved in the near future as a result. This first meta trend is probably our least trendy trend, but we wanted to say this first. At least our authors, our contributors to the book, continue to believe that assessment done well can make important contributions to understanding and improving student learning and success. Systematic assessment demonstrates both within the institution and outside of the institution that we're taking student learning and achievement seriously. Those engaged in assessment believe that it can help them better understand students' learning strengths and weaknesses. But we also have to observe that too few institutions and programs are really collecting actionable data and using it systematically to inform educational planning, decision-making, resource allocation, and improvement of student learning. More on that to come. Our second meta trend, again, kind of a perennial issue, is that we continue to need to navigate the tensions between accountability and improvement. As we said earlier, many institutions begin doing assessment because they have to, because their accreditor requires it, whether it's their regional accreditor or their specialized accreditor. But if we've learned anything in the past 35 years, it's that assessment for accountability alone leads to mechanistic top-down assessment approaches that alienate the people charged with carrying out those approaches, as we see from periodic critiques of assessment in the higher education press, as well as occasionally in the broader press, even in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other national venues. So while accountability will probably remain a key driver for assessment practice, we really need to refocus on improvement. And this is the argument that's made particularly in the last section of the book, those last few chapters that Stephen mentioned a little bit earlier. We need to refocus on improvement. We need to close the gap between assessment findings and improvement actions. We need to find more meaningful ways to design assessments and figure out what the findings of those assessments are telling us about student learning and about what needs to change.
Susan and I are going to go back and forth every couple of trends here, just so you'll have different voices in the mix. So I have the next two meta trends. The third one is assessment requires leadership and broader stakeholder engagement. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. My professorial faculty role is that of a professor of organizational leadership, and really, when we come to assessment, my journey to this work is really through that of leadership. In the past year, in Assessment Update, we have been unfolding the leadership imperatives for assessment excellence. And we've talked about the concept. Well, let me mention briefly what those are, those leadership imperatives, and then I'll zero in on what we mean by distributed leadership. So there are 5 imperatives, leadership imperatives that we're really looking at here. We see them reflected in our trends, and we've been, as I said, discussing them more fully the last year at Assessment Update. The first one is to make assessment and improvement a strategic institutional priority. So it really does start at the top. It requires the leadership of the entire enterprise to be invested in and support this beyond just lip service, but really in actions and in resource allocations. It requires that we attract and retain talent to support assessment and improvement, and really making sure that we build this into offer letters at times of hire and at times when we make decisions about who will be involved in the teaching and learning enterprise at our institutions. It requires that we develop capacity for assessment excellence broadly throughout the institution, including making sure that we have the right professional development. More on that to come as well. It requires that we reward, recognize, and promote assessment excellence and this work, and making sure that our colleagues do not view this as something they do as side work, that they don't view this as something that is happening in the 25th hour of the day, but that it is integral and it is valued by the institution. Finally, we need to sustain a culture of assessment excellence. All of this requires distributed leadership that occurs not only at the top, but is vested in faculty and staff colleagues throughout the institution in both the curricular and co-curricular contexts. The final point to this slide and this particular meta trend is really the number of stakeholders that are involved in assessment, ranging not only from faculty and staff, but to students and to other community partners, including parents, influencers, policymakers, and employers. Given that range of stakeholders that are both involved in and are the beneficiaries of assessment and improvement work, we need to do a good job, a really more compelling job of communicating to stakeholders about what we're doing, why we're doing it, the lessons we're learning, and the improvements we're making. In other words, are we making a difference? We would say yes, we feel like we are. In what ways? And crafting messages that are important for stakeholders and that are valued by those stakeholders. The fourth meta trend is that assessment strategies and approaches are becoming more inclusive, equity-oriented, and reflective of the diverse students our institutions serve. This particular meta trend, I would say, is heavily woven throughout, I believe, every one of the chapters in the book, and that's something we're very pleased about. And in fact, this year at the 2019 Assessment Institute, we launched a brand new track on diversity, equity, and inclusion to more fully reflect this work in assessment and improvement. Although the track is new, the call for this work is certainly not new. We're seeing certainly a lot of focus on equitable access to learning experiences and resources. This is, for example, especially true as we consider high impact practices. We know that oftentimes privileged students are aware of, can navigate to, and have access to them very, very quickly. They're well equipped to do so. But we need to take up what our colleague from AAC&U, Tia McNair, mentions in her book, Becoming a Student-Ready College, that we really need to make sure we're meeting our students who and where they are, and we're designing the institution around the student, not expecting the student to conform to what we're asking of them alone. One of the ways we can do this in our work, and we know many of you are doing this, is to disaggregate assessment findings and determine which groups of students are benefiting and where there might be gaps that need to be closed. In doing so, we need to make sure we're designing interventions to close equity gaps and making sure that we're feeding information back in, not only to the instructional piece, but also to all of the wraparound support services so that we can ensure that our students are well served by the institution.
As we saw in the last slide with the emerging emphasis on equity, we're beginning to notice some changes in what is being assessed. And as we read through the chapters and the various contributions to the book, we noticed that there is a trend to assessing new kinds of outcomes that are perhaps not quite so easily defined or easily assessed. Outcomes like personal, academic, and professional development. There's a national conversation taking shape right now on what it means to educate the whole student. In fact, next week, the Association for American Colleges and Universities is having its annual meeting and is having a full day pre-conference workshop on this very topic, what it means to educate the whole student. And that clearly has implications for assessment. I think most of us want our students to change, mature, and see themselves differently as a result of their educations. So as we rethink what we're assessing, we're taking a more holistic approach. We're beginning to understand that students are not just packages of competencies. We hope that their education is helping them to develop greater maturity, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, professionalism, leadership abilities, and what George Koo and his colleagues called neurocognitive and dispositional skills in a recent NILEA paper. This is especially true for our new majority students, so it ties into the emphasis on equity that Stephen was just mentioning. In the book, authors use various terms for these kinds of holistic outcomes: transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, professional formation. So different kinds of language, I should say, are being used in different assessment communities to denominate this trend, but it is something that is clearly apparent throughout the book and I think is very interesting. If we're going to take more holistic approaches to educating our students and assessing their learning, then we're also going to need to think about how the learning environments and experiences we design and provide support both disciplinary learning and personal development. And continuing with the idea of starting to assess different kinds of things, we also noticed that assessment is beginning to focus on examining learning processes and experiences, in addition to looking, as it has traditionally, at outcomes. In discussions and literature about assessment, the term assessment and the term outcomes assessment have been used almost synonymously, but outcomes alone don't necessarily yield information for improvement. So we may need to look at how and why students are learning, under what conditions do students learn best, in what environments do they learn best, how are students interpreting and responding to our learning designs. Examining the learning experiences, practices, and environments that support the development of much more complex skills than we may have assessed traditionally. How can we ensure powerful learning experiences, and how can we move toward more learner-centered assessment and improvement practices? And in the next slide, Stephen will begin to answer that question.
Sure. One of the things that I know many of you are certainly aware of and can appreciate is the need for authentic measures well, that authentic measures are increasingly necessary and valued. That is our trend number 7 of our MetaThemes, MetaTrends. We know that students themselves can offer the most direct and richest information about their learning. And in many ways, there's been a resurgence and a focus on this, especially at the assignment level, really trying to engage meaningfully students in the curricular space around what types of assignments we're asking students to be engaged in. Good authentic measures offer actionable insights into not only how and why students learn, but in addition to what they learn. What are they learning? So to the point on assignment design, there are lots of discussion around assignments being the centerpiece of learning. A lot of work that our colleagues at NILOA have really been engaged in. Many of you may be aware of the concept of assignment charrettes and good assignment design, where it really challenges faculty to think about their assignment in the context of what we want students to know and be able to do, how that assignment contributes and is aligned to course, program, and institution-wide goals for learning. Also, there's a lot of discussion, and appropriately, about involving students themselves in this work. Marianne Winkelmes has certainly done a lot of work on and is advancing the constructs of transparency in learning and teaching, where we make students collaborators with and co-investigators with their learning through helping to involve and explain to them in very explicit ways the goals, aims, and purposes we have as faculty for their learning. This, of course, certainly happens in the curricular space, and in doing so, we recognize that that's an important way in which authentic learning occurs. We also know that from our work and your work as well, and we know in your context you see this play out, it's not just in the curricular space where authentic learning takes place. We see a lot of this increasingly happening in the co-curricular, experiential, and international contexts. One promising practice that it continues to help document both curricular and co-curricular and other forms of learning are through e-portfolios. Really the chance to really curate, showcase, and reflect on learning in multiple venues and multiple times can enrich the learning process. The use of value rubrics from AAC&U and their ability to adapt those to local contexts is also a trend worth noting. Finally, an emerging trend is the use of comprehensive learner records, which helps to engage students in creating a record of their learning that speaks to how their learning cuts across the curricular, co-curricular, and other forms of where their learning was acquired and applied. It also creates a mechanism to communicate this in ways that employers, graduate school admissions committees, and other stakeholders may value, really beyond what the traditional transcript would speak to in terms of just an accounting of courses and grades in a chronology sort of way. We hear a lot from colleagues in the registrar world that many employers are not valuing the traditional transcript. And so through the use of electronic portfolios and comprehensive learner records, we have the ability to create for students a way to craft and tell their story about the learning that they have acquired. To do these types of things, whether we're talking about adapting a value rubric or creating a rubric for our locally developed assignment, to redesign an assignment, to use e-portfolios effectively, to engage in the comprehensive learner record or a host of other interventions, we know that ongoing professional development is going to be essential for developing and sustaining systematic, well-designed assessment practices. This is especially salient because of the nature of turnover that we see, especially at the leadership level of chairs, deans, provosts, and the like. We need to make sure that that set of stakeholders values and allocates resources to support professional development. We do know that, of course, many are new to teaching and learning. They may not have been trained in the teaching and learning and assessment construct in their doctoral programs, despite many calls for reforms in doctoral education. We know that most have subject matter expertise that they're bringing to bear in the work, that they may not have been trained at the graduate school level in teaching, learning, and assessment. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us at the institution to make sure that we are committed to doing this work and we're developing capacity for it across campus. We also know that because of the broadened roles in assessment, as we've been mentioning, and as you no doubt have been experiencing in your context, there is also the need for ongoing professional development. Common approaches that faculty and educational developers report as it relates to assessment and improvement, certainly internal consulting, peer-to-peer learning, workshops that are being developed and offered in a given context, and the role that Centers for Teaching and Learning, or whatever you term that function on your campus, they play a central role in not only helping faculty and staff increase their competence and confidence with assessment, but they also are well equipped to help connect this to other parts of teaching and learning, the other parts of the teaching and learning portfolio, including relationship to the scholarship of teaching and learning. Again, quoting Banta and Palamba from 2015, development opportunities are essential during the entire assessment cycle, from the conception of learning goals all the way through the use of assessment findings. That cannot be overemphasized enough. The resources devoted to ongoing professional development. Very important to make this sustainable.
And this trend will probably not come as a shock to anyone who's been involved with assessment for any length of time. But one observation that emerged from many of the chapters in the book is that all too often the effort and the expertise involved in assessment work is not sufficiently valued and rewarded by administrators and colleagues, particularly when it comes to promotion decisions for faculty. So we need to think about how we can change that, because the ultimate goal, after all, is to provide a better, more meaningful, more powerful educational experience for our students. And we can't do that unless that kind of work is truly and concretely valued. So most institutional mission statements do have a statement about teaching and learning and its importance and its centrality to the institution, but our reward systems don't always reflect that, and we need to come up with better ways to embed rewards and recognition for assessment work into our cultures and into our promotional criteria for faculty and staff. We have external recognitions like the Excellence in Assessment designation at IUPUI, and I think at a few other institutions we're beginning to consider internal recognitions as well, and that may be one way of recognizing assessment work that has had a meaningful impact on the institution. Finally, and circling back to the first slide, the first trend, I should say, the first meta trend, assessment remains a work in progress. We said in the last bullet point of that first slide that there is more to be done, and I think that not only experts, but most people who've had any involvement with assessment would agree that it has not realized its full potential. As I hope has become clear as we've discussed the meta trends 1 through 9, we're at a point where we need to reconsider what we assess and how we assess, and how we can best foster genuine improvements in student achievement. I think Stephen believes as well, that assessment is not simple. It is more complex than many of its proponents have acknowledged or recognized, and the relationship between assessment and improvement is not a simple one. It is very fraught. We often see a chasm between assessment findings and improvement actions. We often, by the same token, don't see a clear link between assessment and improvement actions. We notice that quite a bit in our own assessment reports at IUPUI. So we need to begin acknowledging some of that complexity and some of that ineffability, I think, in order to really make progress toward assessment approaches that have their intended effect of encouraging powerful learning experiences and improving learning overall.
Susan, I would agree. It's certainly assessment remaining a work in progress. Before we turn it over to Q&A, let's just summarize a few of our meta trends. Let me just briefly link these back together. Certainly meta trends 1 and 2 really provide a linkage to the history, growth, and development of assessment over time. You can see certainly the ongoing tensions between accountability and improvement, and our assertion that assessment can make important contributions to understanding and improving student learning and success. Certainly it recognizes broader and more inclusive stakeholder engagement is needed to make this work. We noted certainly about the emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the many different stakeholders, including leaders, that play a role in this process. We recognize that assessment promotes holistic, authentic assessment. We want to focus on outcomes as well as processes and practices leading to those outcomes. We had a number of trends that speak to this particular piece of significance. Finally, we also are reminded that institutional investments are required through professional development and rewarding and recognizing this work. Finally, we acknowledge that there is a future for assessment and improvement. We believe there is. We believe at the Assessment Institute, with Assessment Update and in our own scholarship, that there is an ongoing need for this work. In fact, we have a follow-up book that is coming out in the first quarter of 2021, focusing specifically on leadership for assessment and improvement, looking at institutional imperatives and stakeholders to engage in this particular process. We'd love to have your input into that book, so please do reach out to us, and we'd be happy to discuss ways to engage you as a contributor to our new book on leadership for assessment and improvement, further acknowledging the future of this work. Before we turn it over to Q&A, we've got a couple of final reminders for you as well.
So we're not asking you to do this right at this moment or to talk about this right now, but just some food for thought. Based on the MetaTrends that we've discussed, and perhaps based on your reading of the book, if any of these trends intrigue you, you might start thinking about what can you start doing in terms of your assessment practices. What might you stop doing in your assessment and improvement practices? What should you continue? What should you consider doing? How will you take up the trends we've discussed today in your own institutional and programmatic contexts? And at the bottom there, we have the website for the book, which is part of the website for the Assessment Institute. You can go to that URL and find a wealth of other resources that have been provided by the contributors to the book. Lots and lots of things that we didn't have room for in the print edition of the book. Here's our contact information. We encourage you to get in touch with us. Here again is the URL for the Assessment Institute, and if you want to go from there to the website for the book, you click on the Trends tab. We also have the dates of our future assessment institutes. If you haven't come to the Assessment Institute, or if you have, we encourage you to attend or to come back. And finally, we have a few questions for you to consider. We might discuss now, or you might discuss later on your campus or with your colleagues. Which trends are most salient to you and why?
Are there some trends we've missed? And we do know that not one book can comprehensively inventory everything that's out there, although we've endeavored to do a lot of that with our good contributors and good partners. But we've missed some important trends that we know you're likely taking up at your own campus context. So what have we missed? What do we need to emphasize more? What needs to be addressed? And finally, what reactions, questions, and comments do you have? So these are questions to consider both after the webinar at your own campus context, but also we'd be happy to begin the discussion now. So Brianne and Ray, we would like to begin to transition back to you and have Weave take control of the webinar and engage us in a moderated discussion with participants. So now's the time to be sending in your questions if you've not been doing so already. And Brianne will now yield control and stop sharing. We'll have you seize control of the webinar.
Thank you so much. Stephen and Susan, that was such great insight into where we are and kind of what the current state of assessment is, and what a great time to be thinking about this as we're starting a new year. And so many of the points that you make are things that I know folks who are listening were saying, yes, I agree, I agree. These are all things that we're seeing, and I think you have done such a great job of bringing those together, aggregating them in a way that we can kind of think about them individually, but also how they interact with each other, as you mentioned at one point. So we do have, so thank you both so very much. We do have some questions that have come in, and I think Brianne is going to begin to have you stopped sharing your screen, Stephen and Susan?
We will do so right now.
Okay. And we have some good questions. This is going to be great. I can't wait to get this conversation started here. As she's transitioning over, I'll go ahead and read. Oh, look at that. She already has them up there. Are there any honorable mentions that were not included in the book but might be worthy of discussion?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I would say that there is a very good discussion in the penultimate chapter of the book by our institutional research director at IUPUI, Michelle Hansen, about using assessment trends and about the kinds of things that we might want to focus our efforts on in light of these assessment trends. We were talking just now at the 35,000 foot altitude. Michelle brings it down to maybe about 12,000 feet and has some very practical suggestions for professionals involved in assessment, institutional research professionals, as well as faculty.
Let me also mention, in terms of the honorable mentions, one thing that we was perhaps not as obviously stated, but we'll state it explicitly now. This particular book begins at the very beginning in our introduction, before we even jump into the first chapter, really trying to give a quick summary of assessments, development over time, and some of the definitions and purposes of assessment. We would mention too that there's a lot of good content that others provide in terms of foundations around assessment and improvement, that just two authors in particular, our own colleague Trudy Banta, who has written tremendously around assessment and improvement, and especially how it can be done on campuses, and our colleague Linda Susky has written a number of books around sort of the fundamentals of assessment and quality. Our colleagues at NILOA have also written a lot around how to use evidence to affect student learning and success. So the honorable mentions I would mention include some additional foundational readings that we were able to do a quick summary of at the very beginning of our book, but we wanted to jump right into the trends. And as a result of that, I would encourage those who would like more grounding in sort of the foundational aspects of assessment and improvement to look at Banta, look at Susky, and look at colleagues from NILOA who can provide a rounded out experience as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Has there been any exploration on how do-it-yourself tools like Google Forms, for example, have impacted institutional assessment practices and efforts?
I think we see certainly at the Assessment Institute in particular, lots of presentations on what institutions have done to make the assessment process manageable. And we certainly see with not only Weave, but other providers as well, a number of technology solutions that are available there. I would direct colleagues to Institute website to take a look at solutions there, including we have all of the handouts from the past 10 years worth of Assessment Institute presentations that are available, and many of them do speak to how institutions are better trying to manage the assessment process itself. One of the things we know is that it needs to be meaningful, it needs to be integrated, and it needs to be valued by faculty, by staff, and by leaders to result in it being sustained.
Well, one thing I would say in the area of e-portfolios particularly is that there is actually a growing disillusionment with the commercial e-portfolio platforms, and migration over to tools like Wix, Weebly, the free or almost free web development tools that are available out there, in order to give students greater latitude to express themselves, and in order to enable students to develop their own templates and formats for integrating their learning and depicting their learning. And it's not something that we talk about quite a lot in the book. I talk about this a little bit in the ePortfolio chapter, but I think that this is a very good question and is probably an area that needs further exploration.
I agree, Susan, and I think, and with the point that Stephen made, that so many times, we find that the software and the management tools and the different kinds of tools that are out there and are available are only good when they are used to support a strong assessment process. And that oftentimes some of those tools get kind of some bad publicity just because they're trying to help an institution do some amazing things, but the institution still doesn't quite have the content, the substance that's needed to make assessment really seem valuable.
So Ray, it sounds like we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Since you're the moderator of the questions, we'll let you have the moderator privilege in asking the last one or two questions for us.
Thank you, I will. So I like this question, the third bullet point of what are your recommendations for folks who are new to assessment? And the example is these are people who have earned degrees in other fields and positions that and now are needing to kind of orient themselves into this discipline.
Well, in addition to coming to the Assessment Institute and subscribing to Assessment Update, I kid, sort of. Actually, I would encourage you to go to the Assessment Institute website and look at our partners list, because there is a large array of partners there who, their websites, respective websites, can really provide a good set of information. NILOA, AAC&U, AIR, ABLE, AALHE, there's a whole list of them there. That might be a good starting point. I'd also encourage you to subscribe to the Assess listserv. It's hosted by the University of Kentucky. Assess listserv, if you just Google that, I'm sure it will come right up. That's a great place to learn more about assessment, and it's a wonderful community who are willing to share practical tips and suggestions on work that is being done.
There are some very good books about assessment that could serve as introductory texts by people like Trudy Banta, Peggy Mackey, Barbara Walvard, Linda Susky. So I would recommend reading one of those or a couple of those, and then I would recommend reading our book because we really use those kinds of foundational ideas that you'll find in the authors that I just mentioned. I mean, we start with those foundational ideas and then talk about what is happening now. How are those ideas playing out now in the assessment field? I would also recommend, and I don't think you said this, Stephen, but excuse me if you did, I think you should go to the NILOA website. It's learningoutcomesassessment.org. There are great resources there. Very good occasional papers, especially some of the very early occasional papers that were written 9 or 10 years ago, which I think were very consciously aimed at providing some foundational ideas about assessment.
Very good. The last bullet point that we're seeing on the screen, what types of improvement initiatives have you found most helpful to students and instructors coming from your assessment activities?
Well, I'll just briefly mention, as somebody who's been a chair and an associate dean and a faculty member for a long period of time, in the ones that are rooted in good evidence and that yield good conversations. I think getting people are doing the classic thing in assessment is we're already doing it. We may not be doing it formally, we may not be recognizing we're doing it. Chairs in particular, program directors and chairs have the convening power. You set the agenda for department meetings, and I can't tell you how many meetings I've gone to over the years where we do not make student learning and the outcomes of student learning as central to the discussion as we need to. So if you're in a position to be able to set the agenda for your meetings, make sure this is a talking point there, and make sure faculty feel free and comfortable to share what's working and what's not working, and they can do so in a peer supportive environment that is supportive of helping students get better. When faculty have conversations and when staff have conversations about what's working, and we can use that as a jumping off point for improvement, that's where it begins, and not a top-down mandate to, quote, do assessment.
I totally agree with that, and I've been thinking about how we could make those kinds of informal conversations and interactions a formal part of our assessment activities, because reading through some of our assessment reports at IUPUI, I'm seeing that a lot of improvement really comes out of those kinds of informal observations. So that would be what I would suggest.
Very good. Could I ask you, Stephen and Susan, for other questions that we did not have time to respond to here, if we send them to you, that maybe you could add comment, and then when we send out the message to all the attendees, we could include your responses?
Of course.
Sure.
How can you say no, right? Thank you so very much for your presentation, for really getting us started on a great point for the new year. It was just outstanding. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank Brianne, and thank your colleague Amber, who's not with us today, for helping to set this up. We appreciate the opportunity.
It was our pleasure.
Great. So just a couple of things as we're closing up here. We are at the top of the hour. You know, one of the topics that came up during this conversation was the notion of the training and the development, staff development, faculty development that's needed. Just wanted to mention to you that one of the things that we have begun doing here at Weave, in addition to the software that we provide, is some coursework on getting folks trained for assessment, both those who are brand new to the field and those who have been in the field but want to think more deeply about some of the tools that we use. At the end, if you, with the survey, there will be a question that you can check if you want more information. We'll be happy to share that with you. And Brianne, do we have another slide after that, or is that about it? Oh yeah, there's, I think Brianne, you were going to talk about this, yes.
Yes, just thank you again to the presenters and to everybody for attending today. Please don't forget to take the survey at the end. That's how you will be entered into the drawing for the books. And it will be a separate tab launching in SurveyMonkey, so don't be alarmed when a new tab pops up. And then we will send out the email, as we mentioned, with the recording, and it will contain a discount code that you can use to purchase the book. And we invite you to visit our Knowledge Center for more resources, and that's where you'll be able to find future webinars, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you again, Stephen and Susan.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.